And when it comes to the rendering, shadows are very important, because very much of the difference between a realistic 3D rendering and something that doesn't look so realistic is in the shadows. Because if you look around in your room where you are sitting, you will probably notice that quite few shadows are sharp. Most shadows are soft, and many shadows have very complex shapes, and shadows that are cast from different light sources are combining in complex ways. And that is what you can see in this rendering on the screen. A quite realistic shadow rendering, which makes the model look very physical. It almost looks as if you could grab it, because the shadows are quite realistic. And there are different render qualities in Maya and other 3D softwares. The most basic one is raycast. And the shadows that you get when you make raycast are very sharp and basically not realistic at all. The next quality, stepping up so to speak, is ray trace, and it's very, very common to use ray trace. And ray trace, for example, makes shadows much more realistic and softer. And ray trace also makes it possible to have reflections in mirror surfaces in the 3D model and so on. And then we have something that is called global illumination. And global illumination is what has been used in the image that we see here. And that is much more good, much better than ray trace. But of course there is a payback, since global illumination also takes a lot of time to render. But if you have the time, if you have the render time, global illumination is very good to render in. Finally, I will go through some aspects of an image that are important in order to make the image look realistic. This photograph shows different examples of specularity and reflection. Reflection is what happens in a mirror, and as you see in the photograph, the city lights are reflected in the water. So that is the water acting as a mirror. But since the water is it is not a smooth surface, there are lots of waves and irregularities in the surface. The reflections are blurred, as you see in the photograph. So what you get is something that is closer to a specularity. And if you think of a specularity is the shiny parts of a metal surface, for example. And what specularity is actually a blurred reflection. So even if you always you talk about specularity and reflection separately, and in Maya, for example, you have different controls for specularity and reflection. But in reality, specularity is actually a kind of subset of reflection. And specularity is not something that you have only in metal surfaces. Most surfaces have some kind of specularity. Even skin. The skin of my hand is, well, a little bit shiny. Have a little bit specular to it. And reflections are seldom perfect. They are often quite distorted or a little bit dirty, and so on. Refractions. Refractions is when light goes through an object, like glass, and bends. And of course, if you have a 3D scene with bottles of glass, then the refraction in the glass is very important to get it right. And that is something that you turn on in the 3D software, and then you can control a lot of settings to get the refraction right. Translucence is also a kind of subset of refraction. It's a little bit like specularity. Translucence is when light passes through material and is diffused. If you think of, if you hold a piece of paper up against the light, the light shines through the paper. That is translucence. Or if you think of skin, for example, even if it's difficult to see in this video, the light is actually shining through my skin a little bit. So even skin have translucency. And sometimes you notice it very clearly on the ears, of course, if you have a strong light source behind the ears. Motion blur always happen when there is lots of movement in a shot, and you can fake motion blur when you create when you render a 3D model, and that is important to get it more realistic. Atmospheric diffusion, that is all these things that happen in the air. Like in this photograph, you have the light beams that are shining through the air, and you also have the effect that the person on the left is closer to the camera, while this person in the middle is a little bit further away. And since the atmosphere is quite foggy in this shot, the closer person is a little bit darker, while the other person is a little bit brighter. And the far wall in the photograph is very bright, or basically you don't see the far wall because you see only the fog in the image. Film grain or video noise is important to make the shot look good. When you render a 3D model, you don't have any film grain or video noise. You have to add that. And this is a slightly better example of subsurface scattering, that the light that shines on the cheek or the chin of the person here, the light is shining through his skin a little bit. And all these small things, we don't notice them, but we know that they're there anyway, subconsciously. So all these small clues or cues is what give us the impression that an image is photorealistic. So even if we don't know what we trigger on, we are still very sensitive to all these small details. Optical defocus. When you make an image blur, and if you, for example, use a Gaussian blur, the image will look like this. And as you notice, the blur is very gradual in going from a bright surface to a dark surface, for example. An optical defocus, that is a defocus or a blur that mimics the blur that happens in the lens of a camera, and that blur looks like this. As you see, the edges of bright surfaces are still quite sharp, but they are growing in size instead. And that is an important part of defocus. Depth of field, that is when some parts of the image are in focus, while others, like in this photograph, the background and the foreground are out of focus. That is depth of field. And that is very useful to create to focus the audience on a particular part of the scene, in this case the teacup, while you blur out the background, so you kind of suppress the background. And of course this depth of field is very often used in when you photograph or shoot a person. One thing that is important here is also to use long lenses, because then the depth of field is more pronounced. So usually when you shoot people on film, you do it with long lenses, and there are two benefits of that. One is that you have a depth of field so that the background gets a little bit blurry, and then the perspective in the face gets more realistic, because in a wide shot like this, the nose is actually getting a little bit big, while in this shot the perspective in the face is much more flat and looks better. And also when you have a long lens, you cut away a lot of the surroundings, so you can focus more on the character. Like in this shot here, you don't really see a lot of the background here, while in this shot you see quite much of the room. So this shot is a little bit distracting, because you see this computer over here and these sound buffers and so on. Okay, that is the end of this one. A final note that much of what I've been talking about now are very specific details of how the image look. And you could say that what you do when you make these decisions about the image is that you decide on, you design a seeing. Because you could, for example, when you create an image, and I'm talking more about 3D rendering and computer graphics. When you do computer graphics, you can choose to create images that look very much like the eyes see the world. Or you can choose to make images that look photographic, that mimics how the camera see the world. And often this is the same, of course, but there are quite important differences, like lens flare, for example. We don't have lens flare in the eyes, but we have it in the camera. Or film grain. We don't have film grain in the eyes, but we have it in the camera.